Hello everyone. Today we are going to discuss the poem Thoughts in a Garden by Andrew Marvell. Andrew Marvell was an English metaphysical poet. He was a satirist and a politician who sat in the House of Commons at various times between 1659 and 1678. He was a colleague and friend of John Milton during the Commonwealth period. He was in his own time known as a political controversialist. He was an ardent Republican and also a champion of religious tolerance. Some of his famous works are Thoughts in a Garden, To His Coy Mistress, Song of Immigrants in Bermuda, and the Horatian Ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland. His poems combine strange images with lyric grace. The Garden by Andrew Marvell is a unique poem which is romantic in its expression. It is metaphysical in its word game. This poem is also classical in its music. It is romantic because it is about nature. Its subject and theme is based on nature, and it is the expression of the poet's personal as well as emotional feelings about life in the company of nature. Thoughts in a Garden is one of the finest English poems. It is written about the charm of a garden. In this poem, Andrew Marvell writes in the fashion of the 17th century, and he combines wit with a bold fancy in order to stress the joys of solitude and peace in a garden. He begins the poem, "How vainly men themselves amaze." How vainly, how uselessly men amaze themselves. Amaze themselves, confuse themselves, or perplex themselves. Here, amaze is used in the older sense of perplex or vex. To win the palm, the oak, or bays, and their unceasant labours see, crowned from some single herb or tree. Men work hard in order to win crowns formed by herbs or leaves of a single tree. They work hard in order to achieve triumphs in the feats of physical or intellectual prowess. In classical times, to be crowned with a garland or a wreath made from one or other of these plants, that is, the palm, the oak, or bays, was the mark of the victor. Whether he had excelled in feats of athletics or war, or in the gentler arts of oratory or poetry. So he says that men work hard in order to be crowned with the leaves of these trees. And he says that whose short and narrow verged shade, he says that the narrow verged, small edged shade of these garlands does prudently their toils upbraids or reproaches the toil or hard work of these people. While all flowers and all trees do close to weave the garlands of repose. He says that all the flowers and all the trees come together to form a garden, and they weave the garlands of repose or rest, the rest which a person finds from a garden is not temporary or short-lived like a garland which is made from some flowers or some leaves which dies after a short time, or which dries after a short time. So the garden begins with the speaker reflecting upon the vanity or inferiority of men's devotion to public life in politics, war, or civil service. Now the poet continues, fair quiet, have I found thee here? Fair quiet, beautiful quiet or quietness. I have found you here. Here means the garden. I have found you here in the garden. And innocence thy sister, and innocence your sister. Innocence is the sister of quietness. He says that I have found quietness and innocence in the garden. Mistaken long, I sought you then in busy companies of men. He says that for a long time I had been mistaken because I tried to seek quietness and innocence in busy companies of men. Your sacred plants, if here below, only among the plants will grow. He says that the sacred plants of quietness and innocence can grow, can flourish only in the plants in a garden. Society is all but rude. Society is uncultured and barbarous. So, innocence and quietness cannot be found in society. It can be found only in a garden. Society is all but rude to this delicious solitude, to this as compared to this delicious solitude which is found in a garden. So the speaker says that the values of fair quiet and its sister innocence can be found in a garden. He portrays the garden as a space of sacred plants removed from society and its rude demands. He praises the garden for its shade of lovely green in the third stanza. So we see that in the first stanza, the speaker mentions three forms of public virtue associated with the emblem of a particular plant's leaves. The palm was associated with military virtue, the oak was associated with civil virtue, and the bay or laurel was associated with poetic virtue. However, he says that these symbols also suggest the limitations of the pursuit they signify. Why? Because the wreaths made of these plants are only made of trimmings from the actual plants. Public life and devotion to virtue must come to an end one day. So the speaker suggests that just as the flowers and the trees do close to weave the gardens of repose, so must individuals also retreat from their social obligations to the garden. Now he praises solitude and quietness in this retreat into the garden. He believes that he was mistaken to have tried to seek fair, quiet, and innocence among the busy companies of men. He also associates private retreat with a holy experience, stating that sacred plants of quiet and innocence can only grow amongst these plants in a garden. Now the speaker or the poet further writes, no white nor red was ever seen so amorous as this lovely green. He says that the white color or the white complexion which is associated with the body of the beloved and or teeth of the beloved, or the red color which is associated with the lips of the lover, they are not so amorous or lovable as this lovely green color of the garden. Fond lovers, cruel as their flame. He says that fond lovers or foolish lovers who are as cruel as their flame. Here, flame is the flame of love. Love or the fire of love which consumes their own bodies. He says that lovers are as cruel as this flame which consumes their own bodies. Cut in these trees their mistress's name. That lovers write or cut the name of their mistresses in the barks of the trees. Little, alas, they know or heed. He says that they know very little and they do not care how far these beauties hers exceed. Hers here stands for their mistress's beauty. He says that these trees are much more beautiful than the mistresses of those lovers. Fair trees, beautiful trees. Whereas ever your barks, I won't, wherever your barks have been cut or you have been hurt by the cut, no name shall but your own be found. Your own name comes from beneath the carvings. So no one can write the name of the mistresses, because from below also the name of the tree comes. So here we see that the poet continues to develop his extended conceit of the garden's superior virtues. He finds that the lovely green color of the gardens is much favorable and much romantic than red and white, which are the colors which poets often use in erotic poetry to describe the lips, teeth, or the face and the body of the beloved. He says that lovers may carve the name of their beloved into trees, but the speaker or the poet finds such actions to be fruitless, because he believes that each tree already contains a more beautiful imprint, that is its own name. So we see in this poem, Andrew Marvell presents the beauty of a garden very wonderfully. He illustrates the calm and pleasant beauty of the garden, and he seems to be walking in a garden one day, and as he walks, he finds heavenly beauty in the trees, herbs, and flowers. He says that in this world, where all things are prone to decay, the beauty of the garden remains constant. And the eternal beauty of the garden makes the poet thoughtful about the beauty of nature. So we see that the main theme of this poem is the peaceful life in nature is more satisfying and than social life in human company. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Today we are going to analyze the fourth stanza of the poem Thoughts in a Garden by Andrew Marvell. We have seen that in the first three stanzas, Marvell says that a person should return to nature in order to relax himself, for refreshment, and also for repose and rest. In the fourth stanza, he writes that when we have run our passion's heat, that is, when we have spent out our passions of our youthful days. That is, he says that when our love has exhausted, or when our passions have run their course, we can do what we can do is that we can withdraw into a garden for rest and for refreshment. He gives examples of two mythologies. He says that when we have run our passion's heat, love hither makes his best retreat. That love retreats here in the garden, and that is the best thing it can do. The gods that mortal beauty chase, still in a tree, did end their race. He says that even gods in mythologies who chased beautiful women, their race also ended in a tree or ended in a garden. He gives examples of these gods. First, he speaks about god Apollo. He says that god Apollo, or the sun god, he haunted a nymph named Daphne, but his race also ended in a laurel tree because Daphne prayed to God that she should be turned into a laurel tree in order to be saved from Lord Apollo. So she was changed into a laurel. Similarly, he gives another example from mythology. He talks about god Pan. He says that god Pan also chased another uh, another nymph named Syrinx, but Syrinx also prayed to God that she should be turned into a reed in order to be saved from god Pan. So she was converted into a reed, and god Pan did not receive her as a beautiful woman, but he received her as a reed. So we see that when god Apollo pursued the nymph Daphne, Daphne prayed to be a bay tree, converted into a bay tree or a laurel, and she was turned into one. Similarly, another nymph named Syrinx was also saved from Lord Pan by being turned into a reed when god Pan pursued her. So we see that even those gods who ran after the earthly beautiful women, their race also ended in trees, and those trees were in the garden. In the second stanza, Marvell continues to say, what wondrous life in this I lead. He says that I lead a very wonderful life in the garden. And here he continues, ripe apples drop about my head. That as he is walking in the garden, ripe apples are dropping near his head. The garden is so full of apple trees. The luscious clusters of the vine. There are clusters of wine or grapefruits everywhere. Upon my mouth do crush their wine. He says that as I walk, these grapes touch my mouth and I can taste them. The nectarine, which is a kind of fruit, and curious, delicious peach fruits into my hands themselves do reach. They are touching my hands themselves. I do not have to go to touch them. The garden is so full of nectarine and peach. Stumbling my hands into my hands themselves do reach, stumbling on melons as I pass. He says that as I am passing through the garden, I am stumbling on melons because there are so many melons in the garden. Ensnared with flowers, I fall on grass. He says that as I walk in the garden, I am ensnared or entangled or seized with the flowers. My path is obstructed by the flowers, and therefore I fall on the grass. Falling down in the garden because of the flowers is an exaggeration, and Andrew Marvell exaggerates this very wittily in order to show the climax of his happiness or delight. In the seventh stanza, Marvell writes, "Meanwhile, the mind, from pleasureless, withdraws into its happiness." Meanwhile, in between, his mind, from pleasureless, from lesser pleasures, or from physical pleasures, or from pleasures, withdraws into its happiness, returns back to its own happiness, imagines its own happiness while enjoying the delights of the garden. The mind of the poet turns from lesser pleasures to enjoy its own thoughts. Further, he writes, "The mind that ocean were each kind." He says that the mind of a person is like an ocean because an ocean has within itself everything that is present on land. It has every type of creature which can be imagined on land. So the poet says that the mind is able to call up images of all things. In this, it is like a sea, it resembles a sea which is believed to have within itself every kind of creature that exists on this earth. Yet it creates, transcending these. So he says that though the mind creates everything that resembles, that is present on this earth, still it creates more than that is present in on this earth or land, transcending these, that the mind can imagine things which are present in this world. It goes beyond those things. Far other worlds and other seas. The mind can imagine many worlds and many seas, a new heaven and a new earth, annihilating all that is made, annihilating, forgetting all that is made, forgetting all that has been made that has been created in this world, to a green thought in a green shade. The mind creates a number of thoughts which become green because of the green shade of the garden. So the poet means to say that the mind not only comprehends all that there is in this world, but it can imagine, and thus it can create a number of new things for itself. It can create a new universe for itself. The mind is unaware of everything except his reverie, as the poet lies in the cool shade of the garden. For the poet, the whole world is reduced to the delightful strain of thought. The mind thinks and imagines. The poet enjoys in this mood of relaxation in the garden. He gets a number of green thoughts, that is a number of refreshing, light, cool thoughts which have taken their color as if from the cool shade of the plants.
So we see that in the second part of the poem, the poet develops his arguments and opinions about nature. In the fifth stanza, he gives a very sensuous description about the physical pleasures which a person can find in nature. In the sixth stanza, he argues that his pleasure is moreover mental. In the second part of the poem, the speaker develops its arguments and opinions about nature. In the fourth stanza, he says how the race of even gods after beautiful human beings, human ladies ended in nature. In the fifth stanza, he gives a very sensuous physical description about the physical pleasures of trees, which a person finds in trees. In the sixth stanza, he argues that this pleasure is moreover mental. Here, he uses very odd metaphysical ideas and says that the mind of a person contains another world and garden as well inside it. So we see that Andrew Marvell has in the fourth, fifth, and sixth stanza given his own arguments and opinions about nature, which move from physical to mental pleasures. Hello everyone. We are going to discuss the 7, 8, and 9 stanzas of Andrew Marvell's Thoughts in a Garden. We see that Marvell moves from physical pleasures of the garden to the mental pleasures where the mind imagines. From this mental pleasure, he moves on to spiritual pleasures in the garden. He writes, "Here at the fountain's sliding foot, or at some fruit tree's mossy root." He says that here in the garden, at the root, sliding foot of the mountain or the sliding, sloping portion of the fountain, or at some fruit tree's root which is covered with mosses. What happens is, casting the body's waste aside, my soul into the boughs does glide. He says that my soul casts away or keeps aside its physical covering, that is the body, and his soul glides into the boughs of the trees or the branches of the trees. There like a bird it sits and sings. He says that his soul sits in the branches of the trees and sings like a bird, then wets and combs its silver wings. He imagines that his soul is having wings like a bird and it ruffles its wings, and till prepared for a longer flight, and it ruffles and trims its feathers till it is prepared for a longer flight. The longer flight is the flight for heaven. Waves in its plumes the various lights, and in ruffling its feathers, the soul waves its plumes and makes light flutter like a flag in the wind. So the poet draws the picture of a bird fluttering its wings in preparation for the flight, and thereby the bird makes a checkered or variegated light, falling on them as it were like a flag in the wind. So we see that close to the fountains in the gardens, he says that his soul discards or gives out the outer garment of the body and goes noiselessly from one branch of the tree to the other branch. It glides amongst the branches of the trees, and he imagines that his soul sits like a bird and also sings like a bird. He imagines that the soul preens and combs its bright wings like a bird, as if it is finally preparing itself for a longer flight, that is the flight to heaven. In the next stanza, that is stanza 8, he writes, "Such was that happy garden state, while men there walked without a mate." Here he starts talking about the Garden of Eden or paradise. He says that it was a very happy state in this Garden of Eden or paradise when men walked there alone without a mate. That is, Adam was alone without Eve. Eve was not created at that time, and he was living in a very happy state. After a place so pure and sweet, he says that the Garden of Eden or paradise is such a pure and sweet, beautiful place. What other help could yet be meet? There was nothing suitable which could have accompanied him here. But it was beyond a mortal's share. But he says that it was beyond the happiness which a mortal or a human being could enjoy, and that was to wander solitary alone there in paradise. Two paradises it were in one, to live in paradise alone. He says that to live in paradise, and that too to live alone, was like living in two paradises. And he says that this was beyond the happiness of a human being. A human being could not, or Adam could not, enjoy such a happy state of enjoying two paradises. That is, living in paradise and living in paradise alone. So the poet is referring to the story of the creation of man, which is told in Genesis 2. And he suggests that Adam would have been happier in paradise, that is the Garden of Eden, if Eve would not have been created. And he says that when he found himself in such a pure and sweet place, no comparison could have been appropriate for him. Finding oneself in a pure and sweet place as a Garden of Eden, Adam could not have wished for any companion, and no companion could have suited him. And he says that it was not the happy lot of human beings to be allowed to stay alone in paradise. And living in paradise alone Adam would have enjoyed the happiness of two paradises. One, the paradise, living in the paradise, that is Garden of Eden, and second happiness was the paradise of living alone or being alone in paradise. In the last stanza or the ninth stanza, he says, how well the skillful gardener drew of flowers and herbs this dial knew. He imagines that a dial has been created by the gardener in the garden. And he says that the garden has been very skillfully planned by the gardener. It is now viewed as the sundial for marking the passage of time. A sundial whose markings are here in the garden the seasonal flowers and the trees. So this sundial is made from flowers and herbs by the gardener very skillfully. Where from above the milder sun does through the fragrant zodiac run. Where from above? Above these plants and herbs and flowers. The sun shines, and the sun is milder because it shines through the foliage. Does through a fragrant zodiac run. This runs through a fragrant or scented, a flower scented zodiac or course. The garden is now viewed as a clock or dial made of flowers by the poet, and the zodiac is the belt or course of the heavens through which the sun and the planets appear to move in the course of a year. And as it works, the industrious bee, the hard-working bee, as this clock works, the hard-working bee computes its time. It finds out the time of the year or marks the time of the year, as well as we human beings also find the time from this sundial which has been made in the garden. How could such sweet and wholesome flowers, how could such sweet and happy hours be reckoned, recognized or counted, but means except with herbs and flowers, without the help of herbs and flowers. That is, he says that the bee which extracts honey from the flowers can tell the time in the garden, and even we human beings can find out the time by observing the changing flowers at different times of the years, because each flower being as it were a different kind of nectar to sip. So we see that the poet moves from the spiritual pleasures in the garden to the happiness that Adam enjoyed in paradise, and then from here he moves on to the sundial which has been made by the gardener, and he says that the gardener has very skillfully made the flowers and plants grow there in such a manner and pattern that they collectively form a sundial, and the rays of the sun fall on this sundial, and the heat after passes through the green leaves can be compared to the signs of the zodiac, which is the name given to the belt of heavens, which includes all the apparent positions of the sun and the planets. Further, the poet says that the hard-working bee, while it is working, that is collecting nectar, is able to find out the passing of the time, and we too human beings can find the town by looking at its sundial. And he says that the passing of such sweet and refreshing hours can be calculated in the garden by the means of the sundial, which has been very skillfully, artfully formed by the gardener, form the plants and flowers. Thank you.
Hello everyone. We are going to discuss the form of the poem Thoughts in a Garden by Andrew Marvell. As we know by now that in this poem Andrew Marvell tries to convey that the source of true and complete physical, mental, as well as spiritual satisfaction lies in the garden. We know that the poem is metaphysical, it is romantic and classical also. It has all the elements of these three types of poems. It is divided into 9 stanzas. Each stanza has 4 rhymed couplets of iambic pentameter. We will first discuss the metaphysical elements in the poem. The poem uses conceits. It uses wit, also far-fetched images, as well as allusions, and also a dramatic situation. There is a balance of emotion and intellect in this poem, which is also a feature of metaphysical poems. The romantic myths about God Apollo and God Pan, both of them who are shown to be running after or physical beauty of nymphs or women, but their search for love ends in trees or in nature. Then there is the biblical allusion of Adam's lonely happiness. Here, the heterogeneous ideas are yoked together by violence within the context of the argument. So, this is another feature of the metaphysical poems. The trees and peace of the garden are also personified and even sexualized here. The argument about physical pleasure is changed into the argument about mental pleasure. Here, the poet brings out a truly metaphysical idea about the mind. He writes that according to medieval philosophy, mind is an ocean of all the things and images of the real world. He further extends the idea of happiness and pleasurable experience by arguing that his pleasure is actually spiritual. Then he creates the imagery of his soul which is flying like a bird and preparing for the eternal flight to salvation. Again, he relates this idea of spiritual pleasure to the comparison with Adam in paradise or Garden of Eden. The last stanza also he puts a metaphysical element, and that is the idea of the garden as a separate sundial. The garden is also has also dramatic and emotional elements in it, which are balanced by the author with witty and intellectual ideas as well as allusions. This unified sensibility also gives the poem or adds to the poem another element of metaphysical poetry. Now we will look at the poem The Garden, Thoughts in a Garden as a classical poem. The poem shows qualities like the use of different poetic diction. It also uses heroic couplets, rhythm and design, classical and educated allusions. There are many difficult words also in the poem, and ordinary words are used in unusual sense. Like in the first line, amaze word is used in the meaning to convey the meaning perplex or to confuse. Many sentences have Latin like word order with the verb at the end. There is also a classical perfection in its meter and design and structure of the poem as a whole. Now, the main theme of the poem is that garden offers a very peaceful life and which is more satisfying than social life and human company. The poem has a number of witty ideas and sensuous images and a balance between romantic and classical elements. It is filled with metaphysical elements too. So, in short, we can say that the speaker criticizes men who vainly amaze themselves or uselessly amaze themselves, perplex themselves by putting a garland of few leaves and believing that they have achieved highest honor or prestige and reward. And for achieving this reward, they work very hard, endlessly. But according to the author, the true and complete pleasure of life lies in the complete garland of repose, that is, in nature. Now, in the second stanza, the poet personifies quietness and innocence in nature, and he says that he has at last found innocence and quietness in nature, which he tried to seek in the company of men in the society. Then he says that the trees are amorous, that is, sexually playful or powerful. He expresses such odd emotions and attachment with trees that he even criticizes lovers for cutting trees to write the name of their beloveds, and they engrave the names of their beloveds. In the fourth stanza, he claims that when men's heart of love and youth comes to an end, men turn to nature. And he says that even the gods did this when, for example, God Apollo and God Pan changed their lovers into trees. In the second part of the poem, that is from stanza 3 to 7, the poet says that he gives a very sensuous description about physical pleasures in a garden. In the sixth stanza, he goes from this physical pleasure to mental pleasures in a garden. And he uses a very odd metaphysical philosophical idea that the mind contains another world and a garden is there inside it too. In the seventh stanza, he further claims that the pleasure in the garden has a spiritual aspect too, and his spirit glides in the garden. He romanticizes his feelings and he says that his soul is singing and gliding from branches of one tree to the other tree. He also says that his soul is combing its feathers and preparing for the eternal flight to salvation. Here also he gives an allusion to the Holy Spirit of the Bible. In the third and last part of the poem, that is stanza 8 and 9, before making any conclusive remark that there can be no question of genuine pleasure without nature, the speaker compares himself with lonely Adam in Eden. He also argues that being alone was is like a second paradise, is also another heavenly state for Adam before Eve was created and she brought about his fall. In the ninth stanza, he thanks God for creating a unique world of its own, that is the garden. And he says that nature has its own time and that time is fixed. The rush and hurry of the society has no connection with the garden. The sun has its own sweet course. So the garden is the only source of true physical, mental, as well as spiritual satisfaction.